everybody, it's Susan. Welcome to my channel, Susan Diamond Paint. February 15th devotional, 2 Corinthians 2, 5 through 8. If anyone has called grieved, he has not grieved as me, as he has grieved all of you to some extent. Not to put it too severely, the punishment inflicted on him by the majority is sufficient. Now instead you ought to forgive and comfort him, so that he will not be overwhelmed by excessive sorrow. I urge you therefore to reaffirm your love for him. Chapter 14. Soon afterward, when Captain Forster had another stroke, Mrs. Beasley and Molly Tucker and their friends were perfectly agreed that it was a judgment upon his wife. No judgment could have been crueler. Under the care of him, now that he was helpless, Mrs. Forster quite went into pieces. Even after their misfortunes had begun to come upon them, she had maintained her old reserve. She had asked nothing and accepted nothing. Her demeanor toward the townspeople was always the same, easy, cordial, and impersonable. Her own friends had moved away long ago, all except Judge Pomeroy and Dr. Dennison. When any of the housewives from the town came to call, she met them in the parlor, chatted with them in the smiling, careless manner they could never break through. And they got no further. They still felt they must put on their best dress and carry a card case when they went to the Foresters. But now that the captain was helpless, everything changed. She could hold off the curious no longer. The townswomen bought soups and custards for the invalid. When they came to sit out the night with him, she turned the house over to them. She was worn out, so exhausted that she was dull to what went on about her. The Mrs. Beasleys and Molly Tuckers had their chance at last. They went in and out of Mrs. Forster's kitchen as familiarly as they did out of one another's. They rummaged through the linen closet to find more sheets, pried in the attic and the cellar. They went over the house like ants, the house where they had never before gone past the parlor, and they found they had been fooled all these years. There was nothing remarkable about the place at all. The kitchen was inconvenient, the sink was smelly, the carpets were worn, the curtains faded, the clumsy, old-fashioned furniture they wouldn't have had for a gift, and the upstairs bedrooms were full of dust and cobwebs. Judge Pomeroy remarked to his nephew that he had never seen these women look so wide awake, so important and pleased with themselves, as now when he encountered them bustling about the Forester place. The captain's illness had the effect of a social revival, like a new club or church society. The creatures grew bolder and bolder, and Mrs. Forster apparently had no power of resistance. She drudged in the kitchen, slept, half-dressed, in one of the chambers upstairs, kept herself going on black coffee and brandy. All the bars were down. She had ceased to care about anything. As the women came and went through the lane, Neil sometimes overheard snatches of their conversation. Why didn't she sell them some of that silver, all those platters and covered dishes stuck away with the tarnish of years on them? I wouldn't mind having some of her linen. There's a chest full of double damps upstairs, every tablecloth long enough to make two. Did you ever see anything like the wine glasses? I'll bet there's not as many in both saloons put together. If she had a sale after he'd gone, if she has a sale after he's gone, I'll buy a dozen champagne glasses. They're nice to serve sherbet in. There are 9 dozen glasses, said Molly Tucker, counting them for the beer and whiskey. If there is a sale, I've a mind to bid in a couple of them green ones with the long stems for mantel ornaments. But she'll never sell them all unless she can get the saloons to take them. Ed Elliott's mother laughed. She'll never sell them as long as she's got anything to put in them. The cellar will go dry some day. I guess there's always plenty that will get it for such as her. I never go there now that I don't smell it on her. I went over late the other night and she was on her knees washing up the kitchen floor. Her eyes were glassy. She kept washing the place around the icebox over and over until it made me nervous. I said, Mrs. Forster, I think you washed that place several times already. Was she confused? Not a particle. She laughed and said that she was often absent-minded. Mrs. Elliott's companions laughed too, and agreed that the absent-minded was a good expression. Neil repeated this conversation to his uncle. Uncle, he declared, I don't see how I can go back to Boston and leave the Foresters. I'd like to shut school for a year and see them through. I want to go over there and clear those gossips out. Could you stay at the hotel for a few weeks and let me have Black Tom? With him to help me, I'd send every one of those women trotting down the lane. It was arranged quietly and at once. Tom was put in the kitchen, and Neil himself took charge of the nursing. He met the women with firmness. They were very kind, but now nothing was needed. The doctor had said the house must be absolutely quiet and that the invalid must see no one. Once the house was tranquil, Mrs. Forrester went to bed and slept for a better part of a week. The captain himself improved. On his good days he could be put into a wheelchair and rode out into his garden to enjoy the September sunlight and the last of his briar roses. "Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Tom," he often said when they lifted him into his chair. "I value this quiet very highly." If a day came when they thought he ought to not go out, he was sad and disappointed. "Better get him out no matter what," said Mrs. Forrester. "He likes to look at his place. That and his cigar are the only pleasures he has left." When she was rested in command of herself again, she took her place in the kitchen, and Black Tom went back to the judge. At night, when he was alone, when Mrs. Forrester had gone to bed and the captain was resting quietly, Neil found a kind of solemn happiness in his vigils. It had been hard to give up that year. Most of his classmates were younger than he. It had cost him something, but now that he had taken the step, he was glad. As he put in the night hours, sitting first in one chair and then another, reading, smoking, getting a lunch to keep himself awake, he had had the satisfaction of those who kept faith. He liked being alone with the old things that had seemed so beautiful to him in his childhood. There were still the most comfortable chairs in the world, and he would never like any picture so well as William Tell's chapel in the house of the tragic poet. No card table was so good for solitaire as the old one with the stone top, mosaic and pattern of a chessboard, which one of the captain's friends had bought him from Naples. No other house could take the place of this one in his life. He had had time to think of many things, of himself and of his old friends here. He had noticed that often when Mrs. Forrester was about her work, the captain would call her, "Matey, Matey," and she would cry, "Yes, Mr. Forrester," from wherever she happened to be, but without coming to him, as if she knew that when he called to her in that tone he was not asking for anything. He wanted to know if she was near, perhaps, or perhaps he merely liked to call her name and to hear her answer. The longer Neil was with Captain Forrester in those peaceful closing days of his life, the more he felt that the captain knew his wife better than she even knew herself, and that, knowing her, he, to use one of his own expressions, valued her. Chapter 15. Captain Forrester's death, which occurred early in December, was telegraphic news, the only state news that the discouraged town of Sweetwater had furnished for a long while. Flowers and telegrams came from the east and west, but it happened that none of the captain's closest friends could come to his funeral. Mr. Dalzell was in California. The president of the Burlington Railroad was traveling in Europe. The others were far away or in uncertain health. Dr. Dennison and Judge Pomeroy were the only two of his intimates among the pallbearers. On the morning of the funeral, when the captain was already in his coffin and the undertaker was in the parlor setting up chairs, Neil heard a knocking at the kitchen door. There he found Adolph Bloom carrying a large white box. "Neil," he said, "will you please give these to Mrs. Forrester and tell her they are from Reen and me for the captain?" Adolph was in his old working clothes, the only clothes he had, probably with a knitted comforter about his neck. Neil knew he wouldn't come to the funeral, so he said, "Won't you come in and see him, Dolph? He looks just like himself." Adolph hesitated, but he caught sight of the undertaker's man through the parlor bay window and said, "No, thank you, Neil," thrust his red hands in his jacket pockets, and walked away. Neil took the flowers out of the box, a great armful of yellow roses, which must have cost the price of many a dead rabbit. He carried them upstairs as Mrs. Forrester was lying down. "These are from the Blum boys," he said. "Adolph just brought them to the kitchen door." Mrs. Forrester looked at them, then turned away her head on the pillow, her lips trembling. It was the only time that day he saw her composure break. The funeral was large. Old settlers and farmer folk came from all over the county to follow the pioneer's body to the grave. As Neil and his uncle were driving back from the cemetery with Mrs. Forrester, she spoke for the first time since they had left the house. "Judge Pomeroy," she said quietly, "I think I will have Mr. Forrester's sundial taken over and put above his grave. I can have an inscription cut on the base. It seems more appropriate for him than any stone we could buy, and I will plant some of his own rose bushes beside it." When they got back to the house, it was 4 o'clock, and she insisted upon making tea for them. "I would like it myself, and it is better to be doing something. Wait for me in the parlor, and Neil, move the things back as we always have them." The gray day was darkening, and as the three sat having their tea in the bay window, swift squalls of snow were falling over the wide meadows between the hill and the town, and the creaking of the big cottonwoods about the house seemed to say that winter had come.